So, what is it about the Dukes of Buckingham anyway? You would think that being one of the top nobles in the country would come with all kinds of perks, right? There's the wealth, the power, the proximity to the crown. But for at least two men who held the title, it came with something else, a fast track to a very bloody end. One was executed for allegedly dreaming about having the crown himself, while the other, just over 100 years later, was so unpopular that the public celebrated his assassination. Today, we are going to dive into the strange and cursed history of the Dukedom of Buckingham, how two men a century apart both rose to dazzling heights and then lost everything. We'll answer that persistent question: how can one be the third Duke and then 100 years later, there's the first Duke? Have you ever wondered about that? Like how the numbers work? So we're going to answer that persistent question today as well. So it's a rainy Monday where I am right now. I hope that you've got nice summer weather, but I've got rainy weather. And my daughter is still asleep because it's the summer. So, of course, she is. So I wanted to show you what I've got going on here, which is my little pupper's Salsa. She keeps me company when I'm making these videos. We've had her for about 6 months now. So we got her from the shelter before Christmas, and she's been with us for about 6 months. And there she is. She just sleeps there. She just sleeps while I make my videos. It's pretty fun. She keeps me company. Anyway, so let's get into it with the cursed Duke of Buckingham. Let's start with the early one, Edward Stafford, 3rd Duke of Buckingham. Let's talk about a man who checked all the boxes for a tragic Tudor downfall. Royal birth, check. Dazzling wealth, check. And just enough pride to make the king nervous. Edward Stafford, the 3rd Duke of Buckingham, was born in 1478 at Brecon Castle. His father, the 2nd Duke, had backed a failed rebellion against Richard III. We hear about Buckingham's rebellion. He was executed without a trial and had all of his titles stripped. That left young Edward with a poisoned inheritance, the name of a traitor, a dangerous amount of royal blood, and a family tangled in the thorniest branches of the Plantagenet family tree. His mother was Catherine Woodville, sister of Queen Elizabeth Woodville, making Edward a nephew to a king and first cousin once removed to Henry VIII. Not exactly obscure. After his father's execution, Edward was shuffled around Herefordshire. He was kept hidden during Richard III's reign, and he knew what it was to live in fear. That changed when Henry VII took the throne in 1485. At just 7 years old, Edward was knighted at Henry's coronation. His father's attainder was reversed by Parliament, and the boy was able to inherit his dukedom back. At least in name. In practice, everything was still tightly controlled. His wardship, his lands, his future were handed over to Margaret Beaufort. Yes, the Margaret Beaufort, the king's mother. It's said that he was educated in her household, which probably meant long hours of pious devotion and a close-up view of how power actually operated. As Edward grew up, he played the part expected of a nobleman. He was wealthy, strikingly handsome, and unmissable at every major ceremony. He wore a gown worth £1,500, roughly $500,000 today, to the wedding of Arthur, Prince of Wales, and Catherine of Aragon. At the tournament afterwards, he served as chief challenger. Buckingham knew how to make an entrance. Under Henry VIII, his star continued to rise. He served as the Lord High Constable and the Lord High Steward at the 1509 coronation of Henry VIII. These were both grand ceremonial roles that he believed were his by hereditary right. He sat on the King's Privy Council. He even got a license to turn his manor house at Thornbury into a crenellated castle-like estate, just the sort of ostentatious move you make when you want the world to know exactly how important you really are. But that wealth and bloodline came with a price. Buckingham was one of the last English nobles with a significant Plantagenet descent. He could trace his lineage back to John of Gaunt, and he had more royal ancestors than was strictly safe under a Tudor king. Add to that his family alliances. His son married Margaret Pole's daughter, and that tied him to the line of George, the Duke of Clarence. And you start to see why Henry VIII might have had a reason to watch him a little bit closely. And Buckingham didn't exactly keep a low profile. Early on, he ran into scandal when he found Sir William Compton in his sister Anne's bedchamber. That ended in this dramatic scene of Compton taking the sacrament to prove his innocence and being shipped off to a convent. The rumor mill claimed that she'd had an affair with Compton, with the king, possibly both. And Buckingham was not amused. He remained a loyal subject in public. He served in France in 1513. He attended the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520. He continued to perform his ceremonial duties, but he made no secret of his dislike for Cardinal Wolsey, who was rising fast in royal favor at this time. He was at his height of royal favor in the early 1520s. And worse, far worse, he started to talk freely and openly about the succession, saying that Henry VIII, still without a male heir at this point, was cursed by his father's illegitimacy. Of course, Henry VII was the son of Edmund Tudor. Edmund Tudor himself was the son of Owen Tudor, the squire to Catherine Valois, the Dowager Queen. People say they wed in secret. Some people also said they didn't ever wed. So it's possible that people were saying that Henry VII came from an illegitimate line. Plus, there was just the illegitimate line, the fact that the Beauforts were an illegitimate line. So Buckingham was saying that Henry VIII came from an illegitimate line. That's really not a good thing to say around the king, to say in public. You start talking about the king's death, the weakness of his bloodline, you're treading on very, very thin ice. In 1521, Buckingham was summoned to court and he was arrested. The charges: listening to prophecies about the king's death, harboring ambitions for the throne, plotting treason. Whether or not he actually conspired is still debated. Thomas More noted that the key evidence came from terrified servants, possibly tortured to extract confessions. Regardless, the sentence was death. On May 17, 1521, Edward Stafford was beheaded on Tower Hill. He was 43, his lands were seized, his children were disinherited. The message was clear. It didn't matter how royal your blood was or how long your family had held a title. One whisper of too much ambition, even the suggestion that you might be better suited to the throne, and your head could roll. Now let's fast forward 100 years. And the title of Duke of Buckingham is reborn, but with a new man, a new family, and a very different kind of downfall. George Villiers was not born into a great noble house. He was the son of a knight, raised in the Leicestershire countryside. He was handsome, he was charming, he was impeccably groomed. He was the kind of man who turned heads at court, especially the king's head. In 1614, Villiers caught the eye of James I at a royal hunt. James was now in his 50s. He had a well-established habit of surrounding himself with young, attractive favorites. Villiers was not only beautiful, he was also ambitious and very, very good at court politics. He was installed as the royal cupbearer, a seemingly minor position, but one that put him physically close to the king. And from there, his rise was meteoric. He was knighted in 1615, made a gentleman of the bedchamber, and then quickly elevated to baron, viscount, earl, marquess, and finally in 1623, the Duke of Buckingham. It was the first non-royal dukedom in decades, because after the previous Dukes of Buckingham and Norfolk had ended or were executed, monarchs had gotten skittish about handing out titles with that much power. But Villiers, he got it all. And he got more than just titles. His relationship with James I was extraordinarily close, emotionally, and many historians believe physically. James called him Steenie after Saint Stephen because thou hast the face of an angel, and once told his privy council that Christ had his John and I have my George. Letters between them read like declarations of love. Villiers called the king my dear dad and husband. Not weird at all. But Buckingham wasn't just a royal favor lounging about in silks and pearls, though he did do that too. He inserted himself into diplomacy, he led military campaigns, and he wielded real political power. And the results were not impressive. As Lord High Admiral and de facto foreign minister, Villiers oversaw a string of disasters. The attempted Spanish match in 1623 collapsed after he and the future Charles I stormed off from Madrid. A year later, Parliament tried to impeach him for corruption, and so Charles, now king, dissolved Parliament to protect him. And then there was the Cadiz expedition in 1625, a military catastrophe so inept that the troops got drunk in a wine warehouse and never even attacked the city. Villiers didn't even go himself. He just picked the wrong guy to lead it. After that came a failed alliance with France, a bungled naval campaign to aid the Protestant Huguenots at La Rochelle, and another siege on the Isle of Ré in 1627 that cost 5,000 English lives and achieved absolutely nothing, zero diddly squat. Parliament tried again to remove him, and Charles dissolved them again. By now, Buckingham was hated, truly despised by nearly everyone outside the king's inner circle. Nobles, commoners, even clergymen saw him as arrogant, corrupt, dangerously incompetent. In 1628, his own physician was murdered by a mob. Pamphlets predicting Buckingham's downfall were passed around like scandalous souvenirs. And then came John Felton. Felton was a disgruntled former officer who had served under Buckingham, been wounded, and denied a promotion. On August 23, 1628, Felton waited for the Duke in Portsmouth, where Buckingham was planning yet another campaign. As Villiers walked through the Greyhound Inn, Felton stabbed him in the chest with a dagger. According to reports, Buckingham pulled the blade out himself and staggered a few steps before collapsing. His last word, allegedly, was villain. Felton didn't run. He made no secret of what he had done, and when the news of Buckingham's death reached London, the reaction wasn't grief, it was celebration. Ballads were sung. Felton's name was toasted in taverns. In fact, the government put his body on display to shame him, but instead, crowds came to venerate it like a martyr's shrine. The body of George Villiers was buried with full honors in Westminster Abbey in a lavish tomb. But in the public imagination, he was remembered not as a salesman or a diplomat, but as a symbol of unchecked royal favoritism and monumental failure. Now, with all these dramatic downfalls, you might be wondering, how can Edward Stafford be the third Duke of Buckingham and George Villiers the first if they both had the same title? Welcome to the world of the English peerage. The short answer is that when a noble title is forfeited, usually because someone gets executed for treason, as Edward Stafford helpfully demonstrated for us, the line is considered extinct, unless it's restored to a legitimate heir. And in the Tudors' case, they were generally not big on resurrecting titles once they'd chopped someone's head off. Edward Stafford's dukedom came from the Stafford family, and his execution in 1521 ended that line cold. His children were barred from inheriting most of his lands and titles. So that's it. Title gone. 100 years later, when James I wanted to reward George Villiers, he chose to recreate the title of Duke of Buckingham. Same name, different family, fresh start. It was like rebooting a franchise. George Villiers became the first Duke of Buckingham in his creation of the title. Because in the peerage system, each creation is treated as a standalone instance. The crown can recycle title names, but it doesn't connect them unless there's a direct reinstatement of the original line. So Edward Stafford was the third and final duke of one lineage. George Villiers was the first of another. They shared the title in name, but not in blood and not in fate. So, is the title Duke of Buckingham cursed? It's hard to ignore a pattern. Edward Stafford, royal cousin, courtier, one of the richest men in England, was executed for treason after being accused of dreaming too loudly about the throne. George Villiers, beloved of the king, puppet master of early Stuart politics, was stabbed to death in a tavern by a man hailed as a hero. Both rose fast, both flew too close to power, and both fell violently. Of course, plenty of dukes in other families meant similarly grisly ends. This is England of the 16th, 17th century. But the fact that both Dukes of Buckingham came to such spectacular ruin has left the title with a certain air of doom. And if nothing else, it makes for a fantastic cautionary tale. Proximity to power can always come with an axe. And honestly, if I was living in the Tudor period, I would want to stay as far away from dukedoms and peerage and all of that as I possibly could. Make me a nice merchant class. I will join the guilds. I will become successful as an entrepreneur like Catherine Fenkel, who we've done a kick-ass Tudor woman video about. She inherited her husband's drapery business and became super popular, super wealthy, had people working for her. Awesome. I will do that, but I don't want any of those titles. Y'all can keep that. Anyway, there we go. A little bit about the cursed Dukes of Buckingham. If you made it through this video and enjoyed it, I sure would appreciate a press of that like button. It helps to feed the algorithm and get our videos to more people. I hope I earned your subscription to my channel where I put out videos like this on the regular. If you want to keep checking out content on other families that were far too related to the king, here's one on the Courtenays that you might enjoy, the Earls of Devon. And here's a video that YouTube thinks you'll like. Thanks so much for being here. Remember, you are deeply loved. I am so glad I share the planet with you. I hope you're having an amazing day, and I will be back very soon. In the meantime, don't forget to drink your water, friend. All right, bye-bye.